Hello everyone, it's Jim Okersinski with your weekly lecture video. So in our transition and all of the happenings over the last few weeks, I never did get time to talk about using and citing sources. For some of you, the content that I'll be looking at today might seem a bit familiar. However, I cannot assume that everybody has had some sort of lesson in how to use and cite sources. So, in chapter three, course unit, course unit, get my courses and schools mixed up. So, in chapter three, that is down at the bottom of the course units page, you will find the first three principles and all the principles of citation and the fourth principle. So I'm going to run through some of these and then I'll get to a PowerPoint about using and citing sources. So please, principle number one. All right, I want to point out that introduce your sources. So I say here, think of each source you discuss in your paper as someone coming into a room that needs to be introduced to the people who are already there, right? So this is critical. I need to know who the speaker is. I need to know who the speaker is on the front side of your quote or paraphrase or summary, all right? What does it have to contribute? What determines the significance or credibility of the contribution? It is important to always introduce your speakers. Remember, we refer to authors by full name, first and last name, or last name only. And then when we use uh, quotes, all right, we use the present tense. Johnson states, not Johnson stated. So please be aware of that as you move through your weaving of sources into your particular draft that's coming up. Principle of citations. I need to know some sort of starting and ending points clearly. So whether you have a source that is paginated, right? So for example, you have to use the pages because MLA is author and page. So in the MLA example here is some prominent economists warn that the Obama administration is moving our nation dangerously close to socialist models. Octavio Peroni, research fellow of Super Economy think tank, pointed to a rapidly increasing federal ownership stake in the large banks. Peroni feared this trend would continue until no clear distinction remained between federal and private institutions. And you see the parenthetical here is the page number. You would find this information that Peroni was speaking to in that publication. And the page number is added to show the end of the information, right? Starting and ending points. Remember, the period always goes outside the parenthetical, not a double period, outside the parenthetical. If it is a quote you're using, the quotation marks will go right here after financial institutions, and then you'll have your parenthetical. Then the period still goes outside the parenthetical, is the proper MLA guideline. All right, so I see the introduction, the ending point. Okay. Sometimes you might not have a paginated source. If you have no page nation and you're paraphrasing, so here we know this is a paraphrase because there are no quotation marks. What you would have to do is just, you could use the author's name again just to signal the close of this particular paraphrase. That way I would know, for example, you would come in here in response. Okay, and then this is the next line coming on. That weaving between your source information and you is critical to document, and that's how we show starting and ending points. One of my biggest pet peeves in writing research essays is all of a sudden I'm reading along a nice paragraph and I get to a quotation mark. Quotation mark tells me it's a quote from someone, I don't know who. I don't really have much of an introduction to it. And then I have to wait all the way to the end of that quotation, especially if it's a longer one, right, to find out who the speaker is. That is not appropriate. You should always introduce your speakers. Now, page numbers are always your friend, so you have to figure out if you have a document with the page number, you have to use that in your parenthetical citations and your in-text citations right here, page number here, all right? Also, make sure that if you do not have something like page numbers, you can use something like the author's last name, I said earlier, to close off that quotation. So really, sometimes more and more students are using sources that are not paginated. you have to be able to figure out how to close that off. And it's usually done with the author's name. Sometimes it's difficult because everybody starts to gravitate away from unauthored sources, and then you have to use the title of the article to cite your in-text. So that way you have to introduce it. It's a little extra work there. That's why I always like having students move into authored sources. So please read um, principle number 3 about how page numbers and how to go about when you don't have page numbers to close off your in-text citations. Now, it's kind of critical here is the 4th principle of citation, because what happens is I need to be able to cross-reference your sources. So, for example, if you're using multiple sources, which I think in your essay drafts, you have to use a minimum of 6. Some of you, quite many of you, probably use more than 6. We have to be able, and I should say we, and it's you and I, have to be able to determine if they cross-reference. So here, once again, is the quote from Peroni, and then in response, administration officials said that banks would be taken over only as a temporary measure. According to reporting in the New York Times, right? Because remember, it's a publication, so the Times is italicized. White House officials repeatedly state the Obama administration's goal was only to stabilize the financial system in a current crisis situation. Goes all the way to the end. The parenthetical here now includes the author, Dowland, and the page or section number in the Times, right? So if I look at the works cited page, what I have here is Peroni to Peroni, Dowland to Dowland. I need to be able to cross-reference, and believe me, I do cross-reference. I go through your document, I match up names to the works cited page. If I find a quote by somebody that's not on your works cited page, then that is going to raise an issue as far as using and citing sources in the assessment of your particular research essay. So the way to do that is let's say you're quoting Johnson in Peroni's article. Well, then, obviously you have to do a little extra work and say, in Octavio Peroni's article, Ben Jonson says, and then continue with whatever Johnson was saying, and I would know that Peroni matches to Peroni, and that's where Johnson was speaking. All right, so those are the 4 principles of citation. So just to cover the basics here on using and citing sources, this is kind of comes into play with some of the information in chapter 4, and I'll reiterate that again in next week's lecture video. But using and citing sources effectively and control sources so those sources don't control you. We have a lengthy research paper that has to be written here. Oftentimes, sources kind of control the research paper process. So you want to make sure that you use the sources to your benefit and not let the sources work you. So you want to practice summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting, which is what we already accomplished in the double entry journal. Understand and identify plagiarism, right? And then the cite sources using MLA or APA. Now, using sources effectively and control sources so they don't control you. Um, will you control the outside sources of your research essay, or will they control you? Will you enter the conversation, make a contribution, or you let others do the talking? Oftentimes, in these types of research essays, students in the initial drafting phases have a tendency to overuse some of their information. That means there's more quoting, more sources. Approximately about maybe 10 to 20% of your overall essay should be outside material. The rest of it should be you talking and interpreting and commenting about your research and what you've learned. So, how to lose control of your sources? Sometimes here everybody does the big data dump is what's called. Information is arranged or selected with thought and care. Information not explicitly connected to the thesis. Oftentimes what we find is some quotes that perhaps don't fit the context. Just to use sources, they may not be appropriate. So you don't want to do that data dump and using your sources into the research essay. So the way you assert control, right, is to support a claim or idea, right? The motive we usually imagine for using information in academic writing is to support your basic research topic and when you're thinking on it. Sometimes you have to provide background information or periodically asking relevant questions and answering them right away creates a structure built on reasoning. So sometimes we also talk about the counter argument, and sometimes we have to include counterintuitive to use of information. So why would you use information that might not support your thesis? That's, in other words, the way we build the counter argument and working with your sources. Then the idea here is to present a legitimate conversation, that back and forth, right? So we've already talked about summarizing this semester. Paraphrasing is a restatement of what the source is saying, roughly the same length as the original, reflects thorough understanding of the source, captures original source ideas in a fresh and original way. Paraphrasing in a lot of ways is much more difficult than summarizing. Summarizing, you can capture the main idea, give it a brief overview of a larger topic, and then you can move on. Paraphrasing, when you're doing that one-to-one paraphrasing, can be sometimes quite difficult. All right. Quoting exact words of the original source. The writer's words should introduce the speaker in the context, as I mentioned earlier, in the principles of citation, and the writer's commentary should follow the quote, right? So we want to, what I always talk about is the quote hamburger. I won't get into that long metaphor. However, um, the idea is every paragraph needs a topic sentence. Every quote needs some sort of a lead in, and there has to be appropriate discussion and commentary after that quote. You have to do something with it, all right? So it's important to understand how to use your quoted material. All right, I'm not going to get into too much about crafting summary because we've already covered that through the art of summary in the beginning of the semester. Paraphrasing, all right, if a summary is a macroscopic look at a text, the paraphrase is a microscopic look at it, usually focusing on a brief passage, right? Consequently, plagiarism danger goes from yellow to red, and avoiding plagiarism. We'll talk about that. Try to look away strategy. Carefully read the passage several times and set it aside. Compose your paraphrase without looking at the source and trusting that you'll remember what's important. Then check the result against the passage, changing or quoting any borrowed language or refining your prose. Remember, even if you paraphrase information, and you've changed it around, you still have to cite paraphrases. That is the thinking of that particular author, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Quoting, all right? When a source says something in a distinctive way that would be lost by putting it in your own words, or when you want to analyze or emphasize a particular passage in a source, and the exact words of the author really matters. This goes along with statistical information that always has to be cited, and that's what you want to use as accurately as possible. All right. Quoted material. Here we talk about the separated. Okay, how we can go about separating the material as it's working through the paragraph here. All right, we can embed that quoted material in your own sentence. Sometimes you can turn around and use just a part of that in your own sentence. Remember to include your um, quotation marks as you use it to combine with your own words. That's totally legit. Okay. And also blocking paragraphs. I'm not going to get into paragraphs, I should say, blocking quotes. I'm not getting into how to block. There should be no block quotes in your research essay. So hopefully everyone will be able to work through the integration of sources and quotes in their essay. All right. Plagiarism. Remember, if you're taking ideas, that is intellectual property. And nowadays everybody is very aware of their intellectual property. So what is plagiarism? Handing in somebody else's work, a downloaded paper from the internet or something you borrowed from a friend, using information or ideas that are not common knowledge from any source and failing to acknowledge the source. When in doubt, cite. Okay, handing in the same paper for two different classes. Okay, a variation of, I've had that happen quite often. Somebody will take an 1101 topic and in turn, All right, turn it in or work with the bulk of it for 1102. Using exact language or expressions of a source and not indicating through quotation marks in citation that the language is borrowed, and also rewriting a passage from a source using minor substitutions of different words but retaining the same syntax and structure of the original. So all of this is plagiarism here, and we have to determine. There is a section in the textbook that does set up some guidelines for common knowledge. All right, how to avoid plagiarism. So collect your bibliographic info first. Be vigilant in cutting and pasting. Mark quoted material clearly. Be an active note taker and do not procrastinate. It is important to work with sources and weave the sources. You must use them. And it takes time, and it takes time to integrate them. If you're in a rush, you're just going to copy and paste, and you may not be accurate with your in-text citation, and that always runs us into a bit of a plagiarism problem. So, when to cite, whenever you quote from an original source, whenever you borrow ideas from an original source, even when you express them in your own words by paraphrasing or summarizing, whenever you borrow factual information from a source that is not common knowledge. And then once again, I kind of fall back on statistics in this particular category here. All right. So weave your sources as you move through the quotations. Avoid plagiarism. All right. And you want to make sure that you basically follow the 4 principles of citation that is in the Blackboard unit in Chapter 3. At some point, I might drop that over into the Chapter 4 unit, but at this time, it's still in Chapter 3. So be aware of the location of that particular of this information here. All right, the principles of citation is in Chapter 3 unit. All right, I've kind of droned on and lost my way here in this lecture video, but it is important that everyone understand the principles of citation and using sources as we move into the first draft. So if you have any questions, send me an email. Good luck and stay safe out there.